I'd like to welcome all of our old friends and our new friends who are really joining our Classical Theism Roundtable today, hosted by the London Lyceum. Now, if you aren't familiar with the London Lyceum, we seek to foster a serious thinking for a serious church by creating an intellectual culture of charity, curiosity, critical thinking, and cheerful confessionalism. So we're all about thinking. That's why we've put together these roundtables. We want an avenue for serious thinking that can promote things like charity, curiosity, critical thinking, and cheerful confessionalism with people who think differently and similarly on important topics. So we seek a virtuous sort of thinking that will hopefully encourage you both in thought and deed. And yes, I get questions about this all the time. For those who are listening live, this will be available on YouTube or your favorite podcast app later. So don't forget to, if you're listening, watching it on there now, you can hit subscribe, like, share, all that sort of stuff. It helps us to produce content and it encourages us, and it makes it more impactful. So now let's go ahead and get down to business, because I know you didn't join to listen to me. You're here to listen to these four esteemed brethren discuss classical theism about Trinity and Divine Simplicity. So I'm pumped about it. So let me introduce you all to each of these four guys, because they're all brilliant in their own right, and you should know them. So Dr. Tom McCall, he's the Timothy C. and Julie M. Tennant Chair of Theology at Asbury Theological Seminary. He earned his PhD from Calvin Theological Seminary, and he is ordained in the Wesleyan Church and has pastored churches in southwestern Michigan and south central Alaska. And he's authored numerous journal articles and books, including one of my favorites and most recommended books, An Invitation to Analytic Christian Theology. But I don't think he's ever written a bad or even mediocre book, as well as all these other guys here. So the moral of the story is you need to go read them all. Go get a copy of each book, including everybody here. He's also married to Jenny, and they have 4 children in college, high school, and middle school. Now, Dr. Oliver Crisp is the principal of St. Mary's College and head of the School of Divinity at St. Andrews. He is also the professor of analytic theology and director of the Logos Institute for Analytic and Exegetical Theology. He has a PhD from the University of London and a D.Lit from Aberdeen, and he's best known for his work in analytic theology. And he's a senior editor of the Journal of Analytic Theology and a series co-editor with Michael Ray of the Oxford Studies in Analytic Theology. You're noticing a theme. He also organizes the annual Los Angeles Theology Conference series with Professor Fred Sanders and is the co-chair of the Systematic Theology Unit for the American Academy of Religion. And he is the author of too many books and articles to count, but they are all worth your immense study. Dr. Timothy J. Pawl is professor of philosophy at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, and holds a PhD from St. Louis University in philosophy with specialization in the philosophy of religion, metaphysics, Thomistic philosophy, analytic theology, and moral psychology. His books include In Defense of Conciliar Christology, In Defense of Extended Conciliar Christology, and the Incarnation. He's currently co-authoring a book for Cambridge with Michael Peterson and Dennis Venema entitled Jesus and the Genome, and is co-editing the Cambridge Companion to Christology with Michael Peterson. He's the husband of another philosopher, Faith Paul, and the proud father of 1 son and 4 daughters. And finally, we have Dr. Scott M. Williams, who earned a D.Phil in Scholastic Theology from Oxford University in 2011. He is currently the Associate Professor of Philosophy at UNC Asheville, and his research interests include medieval philosophy and theology, philosophy of religion, and philosophy theology of disability. In 2020, he edited Disability and Medieval Christian Philosophy and Theology, and he's currently working on 2 books on the Trinity. One is a work on historical theology and is called Henry of Ghent on the Trinity, and the other is a philosophical and theological survey of key issues regarding the Trinity and is called The Trinity. So the latter will be published in the forthcoming Cambridge University Press Elements series, Problems of God. He also has 2 articles on the Trinity coming out later in 2022, one in Journal of Analytic Theology, and the other one is a response to William Hasker and Faith and Philosophy. In addition to teaching and writing about philosophy and theology, he's also an avid gardener and has 2 doctrines. The cited one is called Origen, and his blind brother is called Didymus. Now, 2 final housekeeping items. First, I've got a couple of stacks of books here for guys who are listening, I guess if you want to see them. So I've got like books from Oliver, and I got a book from Tom and other people. Sorry, Tim, I didn't get any of your books. OUP wouldn't send them, so best I could do. But for those who are listening, I've got 3 stacks. So if you want some books, here's what you can do to get them. If you're watching live, just tweet something about the Roundtable and just use the hashtag Classical Theism Roundtable. and tag us so I know that you did it. And I'll randomly pick 3 of you, and I'll just send them the books to you free of charge. Now, as far as how this is going to go, if you've done this before, you'll know that we're going to give about 8 minutes to everybody with an initial sort of constructive statement. Then we'll give everybody 7 or 8 minutes to sort of have a chance to reply to what they've heard. And finally, at that point, we'll have a half hour of free discussion. And then we'll conclude with some of your listener questions. So go ahead and chat those in as they come. So now let's do this. So our key topic for discussion, classical theism, Trinity and Divine Simplicity. So you're thinking the proper way to think about Trinity and Simplicity. What's the great tradition thought about these doctrines? Are there only certain formulations that you can subscribe to? Can we reject certain things or affirm various social modules of the Trinity, for example, and remain within the bounds of the ecumenical creeds, etc.? So that's enough of me. Let's go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Tom McCall to go ahead and begin and kick us off because I think we're all going to enjoy it. So Dr. McCall, I'll let you go from here.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks, Jordan, for the invitation. Thanks, Tim and Scott and Oliver. Good to see you guys again. I only wish this were in person. This brings back good memories of Logos conferences past and different things, of conversations that are similar. I have immense respect for all of you, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. So I just want to start with some general observations about the sort of project of this conversation. And I'll begin with a couple brief comments on the relation of historical theology to systematic and analytic theology. I think it's important that we keep in mind that these are distinct projects, both of which are very important in their own right, and of course with really important relations between them. But they are different projects. I think that good theology, at least of any sort of retrievalist varieties, is going to rely heavily on good historical theology. In other words, we really, really need good historians to do their work well. But the task of systematic and analytic theology isn't reducible to the historical project. Now, of course, happily, people can and do both projects, and they can put them together. So it's not like these are hermetically sealed off, or in any sense that we need to silo the disciplines. I'm very much against that. We need, at least I'll say this as I've done some work in both fields, and but I'll speak as a theologian right now, not rather than as historian, and say we really need, we being the theologians, we really need the good historical theological scholarship. We rely upon it, but it's just not reducible to that task or that discipline or that calling. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. Secondly, and this will be, I'm preaching to the choir for sure here, but I still think it's important to say, is that there is a need in all of these discussions to have clarity on what we're talking about, at least as much as possible. For instance, the terms classical theism, which are featuring in our conversation, terms like classical theism, social Trinitarianism, theistic personalism, the very labels that maybe brought some of you to this conversation, those labels themselves need, those terms themselves need considerable work, and I'll say more than they've gotten. There's a lot of people will make, who refer to this in the literature, will make sort of passing comment to some statements from Brian Davies, his sort of characterizations about what quote unquote classical theism is and what a quote unquote theistic personalism is. And he knows, I mean, he says several pages after the pages that are quoted all the time, he actually says, these, don't take this too seriously. These aren't like groups or, he's like, these are general characterizations, but people sometimes take them as definitions and then weaponize them and add phrases that to me seem kind of silly, like monopolytheism and stuff like that. And then start using these as ways to sort of set up hard lines. The very language of classical theism needs a good bit of further clarification. Phrases like terms like social Trinitarianism need a great deal more conceptual hygiene before they're going to be very helpful to us. And I've done a little bit of that, tried to do a little bit of that myself, and I'm willing to do some more, and I'm willing to do some more today. I'm just right now saying we need to do that in general. Thirdly, we need to avoid reducing the so-called great tradition down to some single element of it or single strand of it. It's important, of course, to keep in mind the continuity that does run throughout the mainstream Latin and even more broadly, just Christian tradition. Absolutely. But sometimes what happens is this gets boiled down to whatever Thomas Aquinas said, or whatever Aquinas is said to have said by the preferred school of Thomism. I just saw yesterday in Credo magazine a statement saying that Thomas's view is Christian orthodoxy on Trinity. Well, I mean, that's an ambiguous claim. If one is saying that, if one is meaning to say that it fits within the parameters of Christian orthodoxy, that's great. But if one is saying one has to agree with all of the particulars of his formulation of the doctrine to be orthodox, I'm sorry. You got to make an argument for that, and you can't just say it and assume it. So often, at least too often, the great tradition gets sort of narrowed down to a single strand, and then sometimes that single strand gets oversimplified. And then sometimes we end up with these statements, these broad sweeping claims about, quote unquote, the so-called classical definition of person versus what's sometimes called the modern notion. And so far as I can see things, the reality is there is no such thing as the classical definition of person in Trinity doctrine. And there certainly is no such thing as the modern notion. I mean, there are different competing accounts, both within the tradition and then in reaction to it. So those are areas that certainly are going to need work. Another thing that I want to say, and this goes back to my first claim about recognizing both the importance of, but the distinction between historical and constructive systematic or analytic theology. And this is, I don't think we should neglect advances in logic and metaphysics. Some people might say there are no advances. Everything was settled in the 13th century. And if so, then go for it. Make an argument for that. That's fine. That's great. Those are good conversations. But let's not assume that. And then with that, directly with that, and lastly for this section, let's not ignore challenges to the received Christian tradition or elements of it. Sometimes someone doing constructive sort of analytic theology will raise a worry or a concern or an objection. Maybe it's an objection that they think is interesting. Maybe it's one they think is actually fatal, right? They think they think it's a deal breaker. And then the response they get is, well, if you only understood the great tradition, you wouldn't think that. And, sometimes there is misunderstanding and we need to sort that out. But that sort of response only goes so far and only does so much. And if that's all that can be said, or most of all that can be said, I take that to not be very helpful. And indeed, I can think of almost nothing less scholastic than the sort of refusal to engage with serious objections, even those drawn from contemporary logic and metaphysics. I mean, that's just, I can hardly think of anything more anti-scholastic and certainly anti-Thomistic than that. But sometimes it happens. Or similarly, things will get sort of swept aside with, well, your objections are all assuming univocity, so we're not going to pay attention to them. Well, sometimes they may, and sometimes they may not. And even where they may, we need to be shown why that's a bad thing. So these are some general sort of observations. Now, as I said, moving to the actual topic, as I said earlier, the label social Trinitarianism, in my view, is in pretty desperate need of conceptual hygiene project. And I've tried to do some of that myself. I'm willing to talk more about that. I'll probably leave that for now. We can circle back to it if there's interest in it. But just let me just say at this point that on some accounts or characterizations or definitions of what quote unquote social Trinitarianism is, to get directly to the question that was posed before us by Jordan, I do think that some of these versions of social Trinitarianism are just inconsistent with the mainstream creedal confessional views. But there are other things that are sometimes called social Trinitarianism that I think are entirely consistent, or at least have not yet been shown to be inconsistent. So it's going to depend on what we're talking about. Depending on the definition, social Trinitarianism either is or isn't inconsistent with the tradition. And if that's vague, I'm leaving it there for right now as bait for further conversation. I hope we return to this. By the way, I'll just say that's why one of the reasons why I am a fan of what other people in this group are doing. Scott, for instance, is trying to take seriously both aspects of the tradition, the commitments to numerical sameness on the one hand, and the robust commitments as well in the tradition to recognizing mutual love and distinct agency within that tradition. So we have, more to talk about with social Trinitarianism, more to talk about with understandings of person. And again, there is considerable variegation here within the Latin tradition. And we can talk more about that, but let me just sort of serve this up by saying that there are really first-rate, in my view, first-rate medievalists who work on this, who see important distinctions between strictly relational and emanationist views of the production, those who see persons as strictly as the personal properties, which is close related to a commitment to a particular view of divine simplicity, as opposed to those who see the divine persons as something more of a quasi-constitutional view. We can hopefully return to that again later. With respect to divine simplicity in the tradition, again, I want to point out, of course, I want to first affirm what I take to be obvious, that of course there's this deep, broad commitment within the Christian tradition to divine simplicity. It's all over the place, patristica, medieval, Latin, and Greek. It's everywhere. But there's also considerable variegation with respect to the formulations of it. And there's not just one thing that can be called the doctrine. There's good literature that's come out fairly recently on this, and I think that's helpful in helping us move this forward. So, again, to the questions before us that Jordan has posed, I do take it that some accounts of divine simplicity really do seem to be, and I think actually are, incompatible with Trinity doctrine. Sorry, but I think some of them are. But some accounts, other formulations of divine simplicity are not only compatible with, but also provide support to Christians who are Trinitarian. In other words, I think that not only can you fit them together, but there are really good reasons why theologians in the tradition have put them together. And they've been wrestling with these questions for centuries. I mean, Gregory of Nyssa has these debates with Eunomius, where both sides are assuming the doctrine of divine simplicity and then arguing about Trinity doctrine from there. Bonaventure has this long extended question, this long discussion of the relation of the doctrine of Trinity to the doctrine of divine simplicity. There are different formulations of this, different ways of putting it together. Some of them I think don't work, and some of them really do. Again, that's just a vague tease. Hopefully we can return to some of this later. So I do think, again, with respect to this part of the conversation, and in direct response to one of the questions Jordan has served up to us, is that contemporary theology should affirm a doctrine of divine simplicity and should do so without compromising a good doctrine of the Trinity. I do think that there are other factors in this as well. In these conversations, I think the concerns about modal collapse are real and serious and should be taken with due seriousness. But I think with respect to the question before us, Trinity and simplicity, short version, I think that theologians today can, and I hope do, affirm simplicity doctrine without compromising, much less surrendering the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. All right, that's I think I've hit my time, Jordan, so
Yeah,
I will
it's all right.
turn this
So
over.
thanks,
Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. McCall. Next up, I'll hand it over to Dr. Crisp. And if we go over a little bit in these initial statements, we'll just cut off a little bit in the negative statements if we have some space. So we've got some built-in space at the end. So I do want to give everybody who's listening live a chance. So we'll do our best. But Dr. Crisp, I'll let you go ahead and jump in.
Thank you, Jordan, and thank you for the invite to be here with such terrific guests whose work I'm in admiration of as well as Tom. And thank you to Tom for some really helpful setting up things that means there are some things that I can skip in what I'm about to say about historical, systematic, and analytic theology and theistic personalism and stuff like that. In my work, which is sort of I suppose a species of analytic theology on the more systematic theology side of things, I'm interested in trying to give a constructive account of the doctrine of God, but one I hope that is responsibly engaged with the great tradition. I have to say, though, that I do think that whilst theological retrieval is something that's very important, in other words, the reaching back to the ideas and arguments and thoughts of theologians of the past and bring them into the contemporary discussion in order to have them as sort of interlocutors to help us develop our own thinking. Although I think that kind of theological retrieval is important and has been made a sort of plank of much contemporary systematic theology, I'm not sure that it's sufficient for the theological task, because I think that theology always has to be constructive in its own way, and we have to, in important respects, not simply be looking back to the past and being informed by the great tradition, but we also need to restate doctrine in a way that makes sense in the contemporary context, and that's just not going to be the same as it was 150 years ago or 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. So I do think there's an interesting tension in doing this kind of work and thinking about the doctrine of God, because you're in a sense looking over your shoulder and looking back at a great tradition and a great cloud of witnesses that have gone before you. But at the same time, you're looking forward to an audience that is dealing with contemporary issues and problems, and aware of the fact that those contemporary issues and problems are different from, in many ways, different from the ways in which they've been articulated historically. And so I think responsible theologians are in a way like a theological two-headed Janus, looking backwards and looking forwards, but hopefully in a way that fructifies and helps the church and helps people understand these things to flourish rather than to confuse them or make matters muddier. So that's a kind of plea for theological construction. And in that regard, I think I would want to say that my own view looks backwards and seeks to retrieve, but does also seek to do something constructive. And the constructive bit is this, that rather than simply trying to repristinate some voice from the past, as sometimes seems to happen in these days, I think there's important ways in which we need to articulate our views with some care. So, one important factor in the way that I approach these matters is the use of models, theological models. Now, a model here I'm thinking of as a kind of simplified description of more complex data. So we might think of a model of an atom in a physics textbook in a high school as a model of something that is really much more complicated than the simple diagram in the textbook. But what the textbook gives us is some conceptual grip on something that's much more complicated than the simple picture is able to show us. So it's a simplified description of more complex data. It seems to me that much Christian doctrine is engaged in providing us with models by means of which we can understand something of the mystery of God. And that mystery is understood according to divine revelation, according to the great tradition that we've already been talking about, and according to our ability to grasp these things through reason. But these things are in a kind of complex interplay, it seems to me, and especially when it comes to something as difficult and deep as thinking about God and the divine nature. Really, whenever we think about these things, we are dipping our toe into a vast ocean of truth that we can't possibly plumb. And as soon as we do put our toe in the water, we are quickly aware of the fact that there are all sorts of currents and eddies beneath the surface that we need to be careful of in making certain sorts of judgments and decisions as we go about thinking about our doctrine of God. Because, of course, there's any number of ways of thinking about the doctrine of God, and that's just in the Christian tradition that Tom was talking about, all the way through to alternative concepts of God that are being touted these days, from process theism through to things like pantheism and panpsychism, things like that. We're really interested in the classical theistic view, and it seems to me one important consideration here is understanding that in dealing with classical theism, we are dealing with a divine mystery. God is inherently mysterious and beyond our ken, but is revealed to us in Scripture and in Christ. And to some extent, the great Christian tradition as well brings us important resources to do with reflection, theological reflection upon this deposit of divine revelation, which has significantly augmented and shaped the way we think about God. So, for example, in the question of the Trinity, many people argue that you can find a doctrine of the Trinity implicit in the New Testament documents, but it's made explicit and refined through the first 4 centuries of the life of the Church until we get the great Nicene Constantinopolitan symbol, which gives us a kind of outline of the doctrine of the Trinity, one substance and 3 persons. But that really doesn't come into theological parlance for some centuries after the close of the New Testament canon. So there, when we're dealing with something as central as that, we've got this complex interplay between what can be established on the basis of what is thought to be revealed and what can be established on the basis of subsequent reflection by the church, by church leaders, in the tradition, and the reason, the sanctified reason, hopefully, that they bring to bear on these things. Now, in the traditional doctrine of God that one finds discussed in the first few centuries of the life of the church, there is this tension between 2 poles, between simplicity and triunity, between a kind of sense of plurality in God and a sense of unity in God. And much depends on the emphasis that we place on one or other of those poles as to what it is that we end up saying about the doctrine of God. So, for example, if you privilege the unity of God and emphasize divine simplicity, then your doctrine of triunity is going to have to be correspondingly thin in order for it to be commensurate with your understanding, the thick understanding of divine simplicity. And conversely, and I think that is an important consideration when it comes to thinking about the 2 poles of the doctrine of God. Which of those we...
Hey, Dr. Crisp, it just hit refresh on your browser, and we'll pick up there. So it's no big. This is the lovely aspect of the internet for everybody who's joining here. We'll get it refreshed here and keep going. I can still hear you, Oliver. I don't know. So the recording says it's failed right now. Well, there he goes. Hey guys, a little insider info about what's going on right now during the recording. 2 of our participants, their recording stops working mid-recording. And yeah, I'm turning beet red because I'm having a mild heart attack, as this is my worst nightmare coming true. I've been looking forward to this event for 6+ months, ever since we got everybody signed up. And yes, I'm trying to both moderate this discussion and do all the technical work on a little laptop, no external mouse, no external keyboard, nothing. And yeah, it's live. We've got 100+ people watching, and I don't know what to do at the moment. So I decided, let's ditch the recording software we're using right now, hop over to Zoom because I know Zoom will work. I'm going to lose some quality, but the content itself will remain there, which is exactly what I wanted. I wanted to make sure people got to enjoy this, what you're watching right now, and what you're going to continue to watch, because you're not going to find this anywhere else. That's what the London Lyceum brings you. So I decided, let's flip over to Zoom, the best that I could do in the moment, trying to do my best. And I'm not doing my best because I don't realize I should mute everybody on entry because I don't have a professional account. So you're going to hear a couple of moments where there's background noises. One of them is actually hilarious, so I think you'll get a kick out of it. But you can't replace this type of quality content. I mean, it's nearly impossible to get people of this caliber in one room virtually for an event like this where everybody can benefit. I mean, you can't find it. This is awesome. So thanks for hanging in for those who watched it live. Thanks for hanging in, those who are watching it now. I think you're going to really benefit from it. And again, you can't find this content anywhere else. So sorry about the hiccup here. Thanks for hanging in with us. And I know I'm going to figure it out. I've already figured it out. And I plan to have a better backup plan next time in case anything goes wrong like this. So thanks for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of the episode.
Seriously, in the way that I think about these things, since without some kind of notion of God revealing himself in Scripture, we'd have very little to go on when it comes to thinking about the divine nature. But of course, it seems to me that's also augmented in important respects by what we find in the great tradition. I gave the example of the doctrine of the Trinity, which seems to me to be a doctrine that we really have as a whole only fairly late in the tradition. And at best, perhaps at most, we have in sort of embryonic form or aspects of it in embryonic form earlier in tradition and in Scripture. And so to get the doctrine of the Trinity, we need to make some complex metaphysical decisions and think carefully in the kind of theological judgments that we apply using our reason. So we've got these two poles, Trinity and the unity of God, and much depends on what we emphasize here as to the kind of doctrine of God that we come up with. What I want to suggest is that we treat the way we articulate these accounts of God as models, simplified descriptions of more complex data. We might think of it like this. There's the mystery of God, of the divine nature, which is beyond us. And we're standing on something like a precipice, and beyond us is this kind of great chasm that we can't cross, and which, as it were, conveys to us the divine presence in some sense. We can go up to the edge of the chasm, where there's a kind of railing, and hopefully not fall into the chasm, but we can't cross into the chasm. We can't penetrate the chasm. We can't see what there is beyond that, except and unless that which is beyond reveals itself to us. And that, it seems to me, is what we have in the doctrine of God as it's usually understood in a Christian tradition. But this sort of view presupposes both a fairly robust account of apophaticism, the idea that we have to tolerate a sense in which mystery is going to be an important consideration in our account of God, and that we're only going to be able to understand certain things about God. It is a faith-seeking understanding program, but it is about faith in the mystery of the Trinity. But it's also, I hope, a program of kind of theological realism. In other words, those who want to adopt this sort of view do really think there's a truth of the matter that's mind independent, at least creaturely mind independent, and do think that there's aspects of that reality that we can access and understand to some extent. So, although I'm sympathetic to a certain level of apophaticism, I don't want to go so high octane in my apophaticism that you end up being utterly mystified about God and really are able to say very little about the divine nature. And I do want to hang on to some kind of theological realism. And I do think there are certain things that we can say about God cataphatically, as it were, positively, like God is triune, or that the second person of the Trinity is incarnate in Jesus of Nazareth. Those are pretty fundamental theological claims in the Christian tradition that bear on what we say about the divine nature. So what I think when it comes to drilling down to saying something more specific about models of God is that we are really engaged in providing what we might think of as proxies to the truth of the matter, an approximate account of who God is, that because God is mysterious, is not going to give us the whole truth of the matter, but is getting somewhere near the truth of the matter, hopefully as near as we can to the truth of the matter. But it may well be that the accounts that we end up with are not the truth, full stop, as it were, but only proxies to the truth. And that certainly seems true to me of models of the Trinity, of which there are many. Tom already mentioned social Trinitarianism as one sort of family of models, and divine simplicity, which is also something that admits of a multitude of different ways of thinking. And there have been significant debates, both historically and in the recent literature, about trying to understand the doctrine of divine simplicity. It may be that we should adopt a kind of chastened account of theism, rather than going for the kind of full-blown classical theism, although that's not a single view, but a family of views. But rather than going for a full-blown classical theism, maybe we should seek to articulate models that commit us to less, but therefore may be more defensible in some respects. So, for example, on the doctrine of divine simplicity, perhaps we don't want to go the whole hog and say God is without any composition whatsoever, because even if that's true, it's difficult to defend. Perhaps what we want to say is something that is more proximate, something like God is a simple substance, a bit like a subatomic particle might be a simple substance, or a soul might be a simple substance. In other words, something that's metaphysically primitive, that can't be chopped up into smaller parts, though it has distinct states and properties and things like that. And maybe we want to say, here's a model for thinking about divine simplicity. It's not necessarily the sober truth of the matter. It may well be that the high-octane account of divine simplicity is in fact the truth of the matter. But
Oops. Oliver, I just muted you by accident. I apologize. Oh, I can't. Can I not unmute you? Man. Okay, here. Ask to unmute. Can I? Let's see here.
Okay, unmute.
There we go. Sorry.
Yeah. So the suggestion is that a model of simplicity which commits us to less might be able to do what we need it to do theologically, be defensible, and may commit us to fewer, more controversial claims, even if it's only a proxy to the truth of the matter. And the same, it seems to me, might be true of the doctrine of the Trinity. And there, I'm attracted to a kind of Mysterian account of the doctrine of the Trinity, that rather than trying to stipulate exactly what we mean by person and nature and how these things interrelate, it instead seeks to adumbrate an account of the Trinity, which bears in mind the fact that really there's very little that we can know about the divine nature apart from what we have articulated for us in the great tradition and in the Nicene Constantinopolitan symbol. So these two ways of thinking about the two poles of God, on simplicity and on Trinity, are proxies. They give us a more chastened account of theism. It may well be that chastened account of theism is a version of classical theism, and it may well be that it's consistent with classical theism, all things considered, if the view that I'm espousing is simply a stand-in for the truth of the matter, and a proxy may be a strictly speaking false but approximate account of something which is true, after all. And it may well be that either this account is sufficient for our theological purposes, and or that it also points to something about the divine nature which perhaps a fuller, more complete account of the divine nature would give us, which we may not be either able to articulate or in possession of at this point in time. I think also this account of the divine nature gives us much of what we need in the traditional kind of the divine predicates or attributes of God, the omni-properties, God's eternity, mutability, aseity, ultimacy, things like that. But it's not going to get us the sort of view that is beloved of Thomists, namely that God is a simple pure act. That is a cost to the model if you are a sort of hardcore classical theist. But as I say, that may be a cost worth bearing, since it is, after all, only a model. Okay, I think I'll stop there. This is a part of it. Maybe I'll just say as a final thought, this is part of an ongoing sort of project as I try to think through these things. And I'm aware of the fact that a lot of the topics that we're talking about today are the subject of vociferous debate in the recent literature. Indeed, some of my colleagues here have contributed and are contributing to this debate. So I'll be interested to see what others have to say about it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Dr. Crisp. And thanks again, everybody who's joining. Just a reminder, make sure to mute yourself if you're not one of the participants. I apologize for the switch over here. Next time I do this, I will be more prepared. I am not a tech nerd, so I'm doing my best. So thank you for bearing with us. Now, next is a good Thomist in Dr. Tim Pawl. So I will let you go ahead and start your section. Tim, let me make sure that you're unmuted. I guess you can control yourself, I think. So Tim, are you good?
I'm all set to go. Yep.
Okay, I'm going to put the spotlight on you. I don't know if it shows for everybody else, but I think it might. Spotlight for everyone. Okay, there we go. All right. Go ahead and lead off.
That wasn't me. That was somebody else leading off for me.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Tim. All right, I'll let you go.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much for having me here. I think, Jordan, you're doing a great job. You got dealt a tricky hand there, and I think you did it well. So thanks for moving us over here. I'm happy to be here. Happy to be here with these three guys whom I count as dear friends, and happy to talk about the Trinity and Divine Simplicity with you guys. So here goes. I think the first thing we should do is get a handle on what our terms mean. And to do that, we should consider our dialectical position. When asking about the consistency of divine simplicity and the Trinity, we are entering into an explicitly Christian framework. Now, for a theory of simplicity to fit within that framework, it must be consistent with the essential elements of that framework. Now, no doubt, someone could affirm that simplicity requires a helicopter. Someone could affirm that simplicity requires being in every way, no matter what, unable to number more than one, either in part or in attribute or in feature or in any way at all, period, end of story. Now that's a notion of simplicity that one might have, and I think both the Christian and the non-Christian alike should agree that such a notion sits poorly with traditional Christianity. Because of that, we shouldn't fault a Christian for, when seeing that poor fit, preferring some other notion of simplicity. So I think that the Christian is well within her rights to screen out notions of simplicity that immediately contradict other elements of her Christian faith, in the hopes of finding a more congruent notion. One such element of her faith is the belief in the incarnation, that God became man, taking on a complete human nature. Now, here's an interesting thought, seated squarely in the Christian intellectual tradition, from John of Damascus through Aquinas and down to us through many others in their wake. The thought is this, that the second person of the Trinity, when incarnate, remained simple. He was, in fact, both simple and complex. But how can this be? It's easy to see how he's complex. I mean, he's got 2 hands and 2 feet. He's got a body and a soul. If you and I each count as complex in virtue of our hands and our feet and our bodies and our souls, all being parts of us, yet distinct from one another, he must have counted as complex for the very same reasons. If my having these 2 hands is sufficient for me to fulfill the ontological conditions for satisfying the predicate complex, then it seems like his having 2 hands should be sufficient too. How could he be simple, though, during the incarnation? Well, here's a hypothesis. Once we find satisfaction conditions that allow the word to be simple while incarnate, we will have also found satisfaction conditions for God's being simple and yet triune. That's what I think. Let's see how it works. So how to understand simplicity such that it's consistent with the incarnation, as Damascene and Aquinas and countless others understood it? I've argued in multiple places in the last 8 or so years, we should understand the satisfaction conditions, not the meanings, but the ontological conditions under which the terms are satisfied, as including a has a nature such that clause in them. And let me spell that out. Here's what I mean. By distinguishing between satisfaction conditions and meanings, I intend to differentiate what we mean by a term like how we define, say, the word courage. What we mean by it on the one hand, from the way the world has to be for the predicate courage to be satisfied by something. So, for example, maybe Socrates has to instantiate a universal courage itself in order for the predicate courage to be true of him. Or maybe he has to have a unique inhering accident of courage. Now, you and I might disagree on the ontology of properties. You might be a Platonist and I am a Thomist, and yet we can agree on the meaning of the word courage. We're not disagreeing there on whether or not Socrates is courageous is true. We're disagreeing about what the world looks like behind the veil of the appearances, what the metaphysical apparatus looks like to make true the proposition Socrates is courageous. What's the world got to be like? Now, with that distinction between the meaning of the term and the ontological conditions for satisfying a term in mind, one could hold that to be simple requires, as its ontological satisfaction conditions, not the having of no parts, since Christ does have parts, but being simple requires having a nature that has no parts. And similarly, being complex requires having a nature that has some parts. And Christ fulfills both those conditions. So, Christ is both simple and complex. The initial apparent contradiction, how can something be both simple and complex, is resolved by reconceiving the ontological satisfaction conditions for the relevant predicates. Now, take that understanding of those satisfaction conditions for the predicate simple that I just discussed in the incarnation, and let's pull them over to the Trinity and see what we can see. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that the doctrine of the Trinity is true. There are three divine persons. They're each really distinct from one another, each having the one divine nature. Well, here's a question we can ask. Are the divine persons simple? Well, they each have a nature, the one and only divine nature, and that nature has no parts. So they fulfill the ontological conditions for satisfying the predicate simple. It seems to me that divine simplicity and the Trinity, understood in this way, are compatible. Or at very least, it seems to me that we've demotivated the initial alleged contradiction in affirming both simplicity and the Trinity. Now, I've got a little bit more I was going to say about the meaning of the word God, and I'm happy to say it, or I'm happy to just put it off and continue on with Scott, so we have a bit more time later for discussion. Either way,
Yeah,
Jordan,
I'd say we go ahead and put it off, just since we've already lost some time, and I want to be respectful of you guys. So, Scott, Dr. Williams, why don't you go ahead and finish this off? I'll go ahead and put you as the spotlight person now, and once I get that set up, let's see here, more spotlight, boom. All right, it's all you.
All right, thank you, Jordan, for having me. It's really great to be here, especially with these esteemed colleagues talking about the Trinity and simplicity. So I'll just say, I got into thinking about the Trinity because when I became a Christian, I learned that what makes Christianity different from a lot of other religions is the Trinity and the incarnation. And so because of my Christianity, I became very, very interested in the Trinity. I first learned about it in some technical way in C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity when I was a high schooler. I thought it just raised a bunch of questions for me. And that kind of planted a seed. And then in graduate school, I decided to work on Henry of Ghent on the Trinity, who's a scholastic theologian. And so a lot of my training has been in scholastic theology. And after I finished the PhD, I started to participate in more analytical kinds of conversations. Some people label me an analytic theologian, though I see myself more as a historian of scholastic theology and ancient theology. And I'm just really interested in, as I think Oliver mentioned, like we have to speak to the contemporary audience and we need to get updated on new arguments, new issues, and we must address them if we're interested in the truth rather than being ostriches and just hiding our heads in the past. So we have to deal with important contemporary issues and take them seriously. And so that's what I've been trying to do over the last 10 years or so. Okay, so one of the things that I discovered in studying the great tradition is that sometimes there are different theologies of the Trinity. sometimes theologians, scholastic theologians, think the right thing to say is very different. So I discovered this early on when I was comparing the theology of Aquinas, Henry of Ghent, and then Scotus. I found Henry of Ghent saying something like the divine persons love that they love each other. And I didn't find such a thing in Scotus and Aquinas. I mean, we can get into the details of this. And so that motivated Henry of Ghent to say and develop a model of the Trinity that was different than Aquinas. And Scotus tried to adopt a lot of what Henry said, but get rid of the more, what you might think of as what we might call social part or social aspect in the model of the Trinity. So I became aware of that. And then I became aware that in reading contemporary analytical literature, that people, depending on their religious tradition, depending on their metaphysical commitments, and depending if they have a love affair with any specific authors from the past, are going to be motivated to construct or defend a model of the Trinity in that kind of way. And they may have, so in other words, they have different explananda. So sometimes theologians will talk past each other because they have different things that they think it is they're trying to explain, even though they're all identify as Christian. So one of the things that I've tried to do is to think about what are some common criteria that at least a lot of Christians could use to help them to have a conversation about the Trinity. And so for me, in the tradition that I'm a part of, like the ecumenical councils is a significant feature of the theology. And then I recognize that this is also true, of course, in Eastern Orthodox world, Roman Catholic world, and some mainline Protestant traditions. And so what I wanted to discover was, what do the conciliar councils say about the Trinity? Not that, in my view, they are infallible or give us all the metaphysical fine-grained detail that you might desire today, but they can provide you guidance for what kinds of things you should consider and what kinds of things you might avoid in order to save the gospel of Jesus Christ from incoherence. And so I started looking, and so I found something that once I started looking at secondary literature, wasn't in any secondary literature, namely that in the Sixth Ecumenical Council of Constantinople in 680, there is a discussion of the Trinity in relationship to the incarnation. And so I spent a summer reading through the acts of that council in the Greek and the Latin, and discovered really interesting things about the Trinity that is not in any secondary literature that I have been able to discern. And so this fall, I have an article coming out in the journal Analytic Theology that is about that and giving it historical context to help people to see what ontological commitments Constantinople III has regarding the Trinity. And so I've tried to use statements from that council to help me in developing a model of the Trinity in relationship to contemporary discussions. And so, I'll come back to Constantinople III in a minute. So one of the things that's also really significant is one's notion of what a person is. So I also have been investigating the history of concepts of personhood, and I've discovered a variety of concepts put forward by Christian theologians, both in the Trinitarian context and in the context of the incarnation. And so what I've come to discover is that sometimes when somebody defends, articulates the model of the Trinity, that they're working with a concept of person, and that concept of person does certain work for that person or sends them in a certain direction in their ontological account of the Trinity. So some social models are going to assume some kind of account of person that leads them to defend a social model. And so, can I share my screen or no? No, I can't. Okay. And so some social models and a Unitarian model make the same ontological mistake from the point of view of Constantinople III. Namely, they accept the following equation. The number of divine persons correlates to the number of sets of divine powers and acts, and the number of sets of divine powers and acts correlates to the number of divine persons. So in a slogan, the mistake is to assume that the number of persons is equal to the number of the sets of powers and acts. So given this assumption, some, but not all, social models will say, well, if there are 3 divine persons, then there's got to be 3 sets of divine powers and 3 sets of divine acts. So the Father thinks one thing, he has his own act of thinking of something, the Son has his own act of thinking of something, and likewise the Spirit. And given that they are divine, some social Trinitarians are going to say, well, they always agree on everything, even though they have their own numerically distinct acts of thought. And one of the things that also motivates this way of thinking is the phenomenon of what philosophers call de se knowledge, knowledge of oneself. So the argument is going to be something like, if a divine person is all-knowing, they certainly know which divine person they are. The Father knows that he's the Father, the Son knows that he's the Son, and the Spirit knows that they're the Holy Spirit. You think that they know that. And then some social models are going to say, well, if only the Father can know that he's the Father, then the Father must have one act of thought, at least that one, that is not shared with the Son and not shared with the Spirit. And then they might say, well, then that means they have their own powers that they use. And so we have 3 sets of divine powers, intellectual powers and will powers, because that seems to be the best account or best explanation for something that seems obviously true, namely that the Father knows that he's the Father and the Son knows that he's the Son. And so that has been an argument that has been used to defend some social models of the Trinity. Now, a Unitarian model of the Trinity, I'm nearly over time. A Unitarian model of the Trinity is going to say, well, if there's just one set of divine powers and acts, then there's just one divine person. And so the divine nature just is the Father, right? So you see this sort of view with Dale Tuggy, and his account of personhood focuses on self. So he thinks that there's just one divine self. So there's just one divine nature, and that's the Father, and everybody else is derivative in some kind of way. But Constantinople III rules out this ontological claim that the number of persons is equal to the number of powers and acts. And so they're going to say that you count the number of powers and acts according to the number of natures, not according to the number of persons. And so actually, let me just read this passage, and maybe this will be my concluding from Constantinople III. So this is from Pope St. Agatha's letter to the council, which is endorsed by the council. So most people recognize that this council deals with the question about whether Christ has 2 wills. But the thing that I discovered is that Trinitarian theology is embedded in this discussion. So here's an argument. Consequently, therefore, according to the rule of the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church of Christ, she also confesses and preaches that there are in Christ 2 natural wills and 2 natural operations. For if anybody should mean a personal will, when in the Holy Trinity there is said to be 3 persons, it would be necessary that there should be asserted 3 personal wills and 3 personal operations, which is absurd and truly profane. Since, as the truth of the Christian faith holds, the will is natural, where the one nature of the holy and inseparable Trinity is spoken of, it must be consistently understood that there is one natural will and one natural operation. So if we're analytic minded, you might want to put this into an argument structure. And so I've put this into a modus tollens argument. Premise 1. If we should apprehend the number of wills and operations according to the number of hypostases, then we would apprehend 3 wills and 3 operations in the case of the Trinity. But it is absurd to apprehend 3 wills and 3 personal operations in the Trinity, right, on the assumption that we apprehend the number of wills and operations according to the number of natures. Therefore, we should not apprehend the number of wills and operations according to the number of hypostases. And so this is, so far as I'm aware, if you're counting the first 7 ecumenical councils, what Constantinople III says about the Trinity is the most detailed account of the Trinity you can find in any of the first 7 ecumenical councils. And so far as I know, I discovered it last summer. It's not discussed in any of the secondary literature. So we can talk about that in the responses. There's a lot more to say about that. So I'll end there.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Scott. So we've got like 52 minutes left. So I imagine, and I think Tim, Oliver, Tom, Scott, you guys would be good with I'll make sure each of you get time to interact with each other, but I think maybe we just pivot to you four, chat and talk about what you've heard now, or ask some questions about the other person's view. But I think we'll just pivot to that and spend 30 minutes on that. So what I'll do is, you four unmute yourselves. I'm going to spotlight each of you because I think I can do that. So if I hit more and I hit add, yes, I can. Okay, so let me do that so you can see everybody. Or add, and then Tim. What's the vote? Who has the better beard, Tim or Oliver? All right, cool. So we've got you four here. So I will, Tom, I don't know if you want to start since you sort of kicked us off here. So you've had the most time to kind of soak up what everybody else has said, and maybe you just kick us off with, I don't know, a question or a comment or something like that. No, Tom, you're muted.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll start with just a historical question, just to get it going, and that's to Scott. I think his work's really interesting, and I'm a big fan of this getting a full hearing. The language of I think how to put this. Let me put the historical question, and then if we get to it, I have a conceptual question. So a historical question is about the divine acts and the letter from Pope Agathos. So you quoted that, and then you immediately followed that with the statement that this statement is the fullest one. This considered statement is the fullest one we have in Trinity doctrine. Could you just say
other texts in the council give more details too?
Yeah. But the sharp clarification you gave was from the letter. Can you explain anything further about the relation of the letter to the actual dictates of the council?
Oh, sure.
I mean, in one way, yeah. All right, just go ahead.
Yeah. So the Emperor Constantine, I think the fourth, called the council, trying to figure out this dispute between the Miaphysites and the lovers of Chalcedon. And so you call the council. And so a year before the council, the Pope in Rome, who was the first Greek Pope, Agatha was a Greek Pope, he convened a synod in 679 with 125 bishops, and 2/3 of those bishops were also Greek bishops. They had Greek names, not Latin names. And so they had a council, they wrote out a document. And so the Pope, Agatha, wrote a letter with a bunch of quotations from various, the greatest hits and the lesser known hits, and to defend their view, as well as this letter from the synod. They send that to the council. And I think it's the fourth act or the fourth session of the council. Both of these letters are read aloud, and then they all are endorsed by the council. They're accepted by the council. So it's similar to some previous councils. Which
Yeah. Can I follow up with that? Yeah. And I don't want to just put you on the spot. Anyone else can jump in too. But with that, again, just follow up with the historical part, and then I'm going to add a conceptual question to that. So the historical part, the letter itself is not part of the authoritative statement, though, correct? I mean, it's difficult, right? Because it's a big deal.
Yeah. So,
but it's actually, I mean, I don't know.
The creed that's put forward, is that what you're asking about?
Yes. I mean, the letter's not part of the creed per se, right? It's an accompanying piece.
Yeah. I mean, it's endorsed by the council.
Yeah.
And it's used in defense of the creed that is published.
Yeah.
And other evidence I gave was that the emperor, immediately after the council entered, he published a big edict. And in that edict, he begins with Trinitarian theology, and he more or less regurgitates everything that is said in those letters from Agatha.
So the conceptual questions to follow up. One of them is just to clarify, when we're talking about these divine actions, we're talking about divine actions ad extra, correct?
It doesn't say that. It doesn't tell you ad extra or ad intra.
Okay.
It just says the willpower is numerically one in the divine persons, and the operations are also numerically one. So it doesn't give you a distinction between ad extra and ad intra.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that's helpful. So if it means ad intra as well, what becomes of the venerable doctrines of generation and procession?
Oh yeah,
on
so,
a pretty basic account of this, and I don't think idiosyncratic at all, but pretty widely understood, is the whole point of saying the medieval discussions of this. It's the Father who generates the Son, not the Son who generates the Son.
Yeah. So the council itself doesn't give us a theory of the personal properties, namely whether that they're relations and what kind of relation they are. It doesn't call them actions. So you might think that what distinguishes persons are relations, and those relations are not actions. But the medievals go into more fine-grained detail about kinds of relations, and some relations might be actions or productions. So it's not going to give us that kind of fine-grained detail. The council itself doesn't, but it gives you guidance about numbers and counting, because previous analytic theologians in the late 20th century try to interpret the Nicene Creed, and will interpret it in a way where you get the Father has numerically distinct powers from the Son, but Constantinople III rules that out. So so the idea is that if the councils have authority for you, or at least guidance for you, then you need to be confronted by this,
Sure,
and somehow deal with it. And that's what I've been trying to do. Yeah. Good.
Cool.
Can you say more about the argument as to why the de se knowledge doesn't go through? I mean, your modus tollens said, the minor premise says, of course, it's absurd, but
Yeah.
why is that? Is there more explanation in the from Pope Agatha?
Oh, okay. So the Sixth Council doesn't talk about de se knowledge, but I was saying that for contemporary people, what motivates some sort of social model is de se knowledge, so that you have self-knowledge, and so you need some kind of account of that. And so now you're confronted with a situation where you've got this council that seems to say, or it seems to not fit well with the idea of de se knowledge. And so one route you could go is, all right, cool, there is no de se knowledge in the Trinity. It's not very interesting. You might think that, or you might think, no, de se knowledge is an important fact. And so you might try to give an account of that.
So just to be clear on your claim is not that the council explicitly rules it out. It's that it contains things that either implicitly lead us to reject any concerns about de se knowledge. Okay.
Yeah.
But it's not
right.
explicit.
That's right. It doesn't give you de se knowledge, and not that. It doesn't talk about it. So
okay.
It does talk about de se knowledge in the case of the incarnation, right? Because Jesus knows that he's got a human nature that's different than the Father's. And in my article, there are arguments to this effect, where the council talks about Jesus as I statements. Yeah. Tim probably knows a lot more about that stuff.
Mm-hmm. So Scott, sorry, Jordan, is it all right if I jump in or not?
Yeah, go for it. That's the whole point. So you guys just chat.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I was interested in what each of the three of you had to say for different reasons, but since Scott's just been talking, it's interesting to me that it looks like what you're saying is that the discussion about diatheletism effectively sort of puts a kind of pressure on what we think about carving up persons and natures in the Trinity, right? The kind of idea being that wills are reserved to natures, not persons, being powers. So Christ can have a human will and a divine will that are distinct, hence diotheletism, two willsism. and that this therefore has important implications in the materials that you've been looking at in particular for how we think about the divine persons of the Trinity as well. That's the novelty, right?
Yes, that's right. And there's Johannes Gruber published a book this ago, right? And he details a lot of the prehistory, but he doesn't talk about the Sixth Council. So I take what
I suppose. I know you don't want to go into great details about your current discussion with someone like William Hasker, but I suppose someone like Hasker's just going to could simply just say, well, so much the worse for the council.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Yes, you can do that. I mean, they have other motivations to, right? You might think of, there's one ultimate source for all contingent beings. You want to have a account of the Trinity that's somehow consistent with some version of ancient Judaism. And so that those kinds of considerations might tempt you to want to give the Sixth Council a shot, see what you can do with it, rather than give up on it.
Yeah, I guess a concern I have is that it's not clear to me that you have a doctrine of Trinity without conciliar theology. And so that's a pretty significant move to make. I suppose you could simply say, well, look, there are various options on the doctrine of the Trinity on offer. There are various accounts, and you pay money and you take your choice. And if the account that I prefer, on balance, has this particular metaphysical cost that it's inconsistent with one of the conciliar documents, that's a problem. But it's not necessarily a knockdown drag-out reason to reject the view if the view has other independent reasons for thinking that we should take it seriously. For example, it's a better account of persons or something like that, right?
So if I can follow up, Scott, and I want us to move on, but I'm really fascinated in this part of the conversation. You refer to your own view, which is trying to be consistent with these historical statements, correct?
Right.
But you also refer to your own view as a sort of, or you have referred to as a Latin social view or a conciliar social view. Can you say what's social about your account?
There is de se knowledge.
Yeah.
The Father knows he's the Father, and he knows he's not the Son.
Yep.
I think that in some ways that might be the difference between a social and a non-social view. It may not be. My suspicion is that whatever a non-social view is, that they haven't fully confronted the ontology of de se knowledge. Or you can try to go some kind of Sabellianism, like Brian Laftel does, where he kind of speaks of God as what I refer to as one Boethian person who's three Lockean persons.
Yeah, right.
And what's great in my research, we're writing a book on Henry of Ghent, and he has this sentence where he says something like, you may be tempted to think the divine nature is a person because it's a singular thing, but wait, it doesn't have the determination of personhood because it doesn't have the incommunicable personal property itself. Only the persons have those. So I suspect if Henry were here, he'd say Brian has taken the bait. Yeah.
Speaking of Trinity and simplicity, that's probably going to be one view that's really hard to square with simplicity, despite the fact that he labels his view a Latin social Trinity.
Yeah.
Partly because he talks about three different temporal parts of God. So if you've got temporal parts, you've got parts.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
That would leave that aside. Yeah.
I had a question. Can I raise it to? It's to Oliver, and it's we're gonna have a beard off here. No, I'd like to know. You talked at some points about the views, the doctrines being not true, strictly speaking, false, but close to.
I could see you sort of, as soon as I said that, I could see you like, oh, it's a quill moving furiously across the page at that point.
Got lots of notes over here. And so I wonder two things. You also said earlier, at the very beginning of your talk, you said that we have to speak to the current problems and situations that we find ourselves in as well. We have to represent the doctrine in the contemporary mode. And I wonder, for both those things, for one, the chastisement, which leaves us with maybe less than we thought we had, and the speaking in the contemporary mode, there's got to be some sort of line where you can say, you tried to speak in the contemporary mode, but you goofed up. That's not really what they meant, even with the new words. Or it's got to be a line where you say, I've been chastised, sure, but I still have to think that Christ was a true man. Like whatever else you chastise and take away from me, true manhood shouldn't be one of the things that goes. So there's a line for both those, a line whether you get the new language of the old thoughts right, and a line whether you your chastisement goes too far and takes away something really essential. And I wonder, is it the same line in both cases? Can you use the same measure to tell whether you're speaking the old doctrine in new words and whether or not you've given up more than you need to give up? Or is it different lines? And I wonder, in either case, if you could tell us how we go about figuring out whether we've done it right.
Well, I think this is really one of the $6 million questions about thinking, creatively and constructively about the doctrine of God today, is that we are trying to speak to current problems, and any kind of construction, theological construction, is a dangerous business. We need hard hats, and we often get it wrong. But I think part of my concern in my opening remarks is to get at something slightly different, which is that in systematic theology these days, there are a number of systematic theologians who seem to think that retrieving the right theologian gets you what you need. And particularly at the moment, it's Thomas Aquinas. Thomas is the flavor of the month for various reasons. So the idea is, yes, I thought you might like it. So the idea is that you retrieve your Thomism, and if you get that right, and you set out all your doctrinal ducks in a row, then you've done due diligence. That's what you need to do, because provided you understand that Thomas is the theologian of choice for that kind of project of retrieval. That just doesn't seem to me to be enough. And it seems to me that it's not enough because there are various concerns that we face today that we need to address, and I think also because it's at least arguable that Thomas may have got some things wrong. He's not infallible. It may well be that certain metaphysical claims he makes a mistake, and these things need to be argued for. We can't simply take it on trust. So that's really what I was trying to get at. I mean, I do think that the vast majority of theology, like the vast majority of philosophy, is probably false. But we're all trying our best, philosophers and theologians, and the game is played. And sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. You ask, well, on what principle basis can we make those kinds of judgments? Well, it's complicated. And that's really what I was getting at when I was trying to talk about sources of authority when we make theological judgments. Because we've got divine revelation as a control of some description. We've got the great tradition as a control of some description. We've got reason as a control of some description. But of course, different thinkers are going to privilege one or more of those particular sources, and that's going to color the sorts of judgments they come to in significant ways. And that's precisely why we're having this discussion here, right? I mean, represented here, we've got at least 4 different views of the Trinity that, at least some of those are going to be incommensurate with one another. They can't all be right. Maybe none of them are right. Hopefully one of them is right. But that's what I mean by the game being played. And to simply say, we have to make a judgment, but how do we make a principal judgment call? Well, it much depends on what you're privileging and where the onus of emphasis lies in the theological judgments that you make. I mean, for yourself, for example, being both a Thomist and a Roman Catholic who takes the tradition very seriously, the conciliar, the kind of consensus of conciliar decisions on something like Christology, as you've made very clear in your 2 books on Christology, carries a lot of weight, and it's gonna be a kind of significant doctrinal control on what you want to say about the doctrine of God and Christology. But you're going to get Protestants like William Hasker, who's going to come out along and say, well, I don't feel the same pressure to ensure that my theological conclusions line up in the same way that Tim does, because I have a different account of the nature of tradition and the authority that it generates. So that's right. That's what I have in mind.
I like what you said there, Oliver, about the flavor of the month and how it's not sufficient to act in that manner. And I think even for those who are drawn to Thomas, like I am, you might be saying what Thomas says, but you're not doing what Thomas does in the situation. Because if you look at, for instance, his treatment of the Latin Averroists, those who thought that there is only a single substantial form that all human persons have, he doesn't just say, well, that's a novelty and that's kind of silly. And if you just look at what Augustine said, you'll see it's wrong. He instead takes, if I recall correctly, 24 different arguments for the truth of that claim in his Thomistic way. You know, here's a first argument, here's a second, and then he rebuts them all. So he's going to the contemporary notions in his milieu, and he's giving his best arguments, first giving their best arguments for the position, and then giving his own arguments against it. So I think you're right. The Thomas says P, therefore P move is a very unthomistic move to make. It's unscholastic, as Tom said earlier, too.
Yeah, it seems to me that's right as well.
Guys, I have a question for you, if you don't mind me jumping in here. So, you know, I'm super interested in this area, obviously. But one thing I think, Oliver, you mentioned and noticed where it does seem that at least in my Protestant circles, Thomas is a little bit of the flavor of the month. Can you talk to a little bit, any of you guys, is Thomas, like, do we need to have, like, Tim, obviously I think you're gonna have a good answer for this. Do we need Thomas Aquinas to be within the great tradition, or can we modify him in particular ways? Are there people outside of him who are doing similar things, making different moves that we could say, yes, I think this is somebody who's within the tradition, but has some differences? I don't know who wants to take that question, but that's something that I've seen a lot. People have questions about. I have a question about it. I'm curious. So I don't know who wants to answer that. Tim, maybe Tim, you start. You're a Roman Catholic, and then Scott, you can take a stab at it, and then
All
Tom.
Right, I will answer.
Everybody.
I'm gonna first go lock my door though in my office. Okay. All right. You don't need Thomas Aquinas. He's super good. I think he's the way you should go. But I think there's plenty of other views consistent with the orthodoxy that are worked out well. I know Tom, including concerning simplicity, Tom has worked them out in a little article, I want to say in an edited volume for the LA Theo, but I'm not sure. Different ways you can understand simplicity. My colleague, Mark Spencer, whom I could take in a fight, so I didn't lock the door for his sake. I could take him if he came in. It's all the other Thomists I'm worried about in mass when I say you don't need Aquinas. My colleague, Mark Spencer, has a paper called The Flexibility of Divine Simplicity, where he takes Palamas, Scotus, and Aquinas and talks about the ways in which you can hold those views. He thinks you can hold them all together at once. Mark likes to synthesize everything. But the point I'm trying to make is Aquinas is not a necessary condition for good theology. I kind of think it's a sufficient condition. I think if you have Aquinas, you can do a really good job of doing theology within orthodoxy, but I don't think he's a necessary condition.
Scott, you want to take a stab at what you're going to say, and then Tom?
Oh, sure. So I mean, I know medievals the best, and so I'm best situated to comment on those people. And having read way too much Scotus and Aquinas and others, I mean, I think Duns Scotus is massively underappreciated in his account of the Trinity in terms of secondary literature. I'm tempted to say, though I won't assert, that Scotus has the most refined account of the Trinity in the history of the tradition. It's tempting to say that once you get into the details of it. And much improvements on Aquinas, I think, on various issues regarding simplicity.
Please don't hesitate to be in time.
I mean, he's got the formal distinction. That's what we needed. But I also think that anybody who reads a lot of the tradition and is philosophically attuned is going to be better placed than somebody who has the one favorite interlocutor, I think, because one of the rules in graduate school is whoever your favorite person is, you have to find things you disagree with them about. If you're not open to that, then you're treating them like a cult figure, and you're treating them like they're always right, and you might treat them like they're infallible, and you might not read other people. And I think that's mistake, right? So that's, I think you need to read widely in the both in the ancient world, and in the, I mean, I'll just give a plug for Johannes Zakuber's book. His discussion of Trinitarian theology in the 400s, 500s, and 600s is important, because a lot of the thing that Tim did in his talk was start with Christology and then go to the Trinity. That's precisely the sort of a historical trajectory that happened. You had the Cappadocians who said stuff about the Trinity, all these discussions about the incarnation, and then a bunch of people say, wait, we're talking about person and nature, and we said that in the Trinity, so how does that work? And then there were problems that were raised regarding that, and so you had to have revisions of the Cappadocians in the 600s, because their account of person didn't quite work in the case of the Trinity when you wanted to say that the divine nature is a singular thing. Anyways, yeah, so that's all I'll say, I guess.
Thanks, Scott. Tom, what do you have?
So I want to say amen to almost everything Tim said. No, seriously, it's great. I am often in, close, sometimes just almost in awe of Thomas. I don't think you need him for good theology. I also want to say amen to what Scott said. And on some things, I think that other figures, other medieval theologians actually correct him well and give us something better. Amen to formal distinction, big time. Totally with that. But what I really want to say is, I want to say something about the distinctly Protestant scholastic reception of these figures. Because sometimes people draw like there's a sort of straight line, like the Reformed and Lutheran scholastics, they're Thomistic, especially the Reformed. That's sort of a line one hears quite a bit. And yeah, obviously there's some truth to that. We should see that. But many times the actual evidence that's supplied in support of such claims, someone will say, Owen or so-and-so, pick your favorite theologian, is a Thomist. See, he endorses simplicity. But you look at what's actually said about simplicity, and it's what pretty much anyone could have said from the tradition about simplicity. And you can see that going on and on. So here's the thing, 2 points about the Protestant scholastic reception of these medieval theologians. And these points are in addition to the points made by Muller and David Seitzman, all this really good work that's been done. I'm making 2 points in addition to those. And the first is that in many cases, I think it's pretty clear that these Protestant scholastics had their medieval scholasticism to them both directly, but also in many cases in ways that were mediated. So they were reading the Salamanca theologians, they're reading Suarez, they're getting things in a mediated way. So even where it's Thomist, it would be a school of Thomism that's sometimes feeding that. And secondly, they're not just, even the ones we think of as Thomist, in many cases are not just rolling with Thomas. Like he said it, we believe it, that settles it for us. That's just not what's going on. Turretin, for instance, when he's wrestling with the Trinity and Simplicity question, one of the worries that arises with that, of course, is if there's no real distinction between person and essence, but there is supposed to be a real distinction between person and person, then given transitivity of identity, we got a problem. And when you would see Turretin wrestling with this, he reaches for the modal distinction. The modal distinction is not something you're going to find in Thomas Aquinas. It isn't. It is something you're going to find in Suarez and the Suarezians. I mean, it's just there. He thinks that's the third way to think about distinctions. And whether or not it actually works for the doctrine of the Trinity, like Turretin thinks it's going to, that's another discussion. Short answer, it doesn't. But whether or not it does is another thing. My point is just the methodological point. The Reformed and Lutheran scholastics are not just saying Thomas got it right, and now we're just going to tweak the parts we don't like about, say, justification or whatever. They're not. They're receiving this deeper, broader medieval and patristic tradition. They, in many cases, have a lot of appreciation for Aquinas, but they're not afraid to make corrections as they go. It's the corrections aren't just on the doctrine of the church or something like that, or justification. The corrections also occur in their discussions of the doctrine of God. All right, sorry, that's enough.
That's helpful. Thanks, Tom. Scott, go ahead.
I have a question for Tim. So you claim that a person is simple because they've got a simple nature, or if they got a simple nature. Is that all there is to say about a person? I mean, it seems like a divine person is going to be not simple if we think that they also have a attribute or a part that is not the divine nature. And this is the, the personal properties. So if you have a person who's constituted by the simple nature and a personal property, you might think the person is not simple in virtue of those two constituents. So if we ignore the personal constituent, sure, you can say they're simple, but they've got some other incommunicable property that would make a person more complex than the divine nature. So what do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to ask you a question about what the medievals thought first, and then I'll tell you my answer. But it's a short question. The question: did any of those guys who thought you had a composite of a divine nature and a personal property in a divine person, did any of those guys deny simplicity, or did they think that simplicity was still affirmed even when you had a thing that had a divine nature and a personal property with it? I thought they all affirmed simplicity still, but you know this stuff better than I do.
Yeah. Let me think. Yeah, they're all going to want to say simplicity, right, is made true by the nature, but if we're talking about the persons themselves, it seems like, so Henry of Ghent, and he kind of got this language going, saying that persons are constituted. The language of so he rejects composition. So the basic difference between composition and constitution is whether the parts are separable or inseparable, right? So, and if you have inseparable parts, then that could be consistent with the count of simplicity if it just means whatever's there necessarily is there, and there's no counterfactual where there's one lacking. I think the medievals probably fit with what you're saying, though Scotus might not, because he thinks that a personal property is finite and the divine nature is infinite. So a divine person has a finite part and an infinite part.
But he affirmed divine simplicity too, I thought.
He did, yeah. Well, with formal distinctions, yeah.
Yeah. As long as all those guys are happy to affirm that a thing can be simple and have a divine nature and also have another, whatever it is, a mode, a doodad, have another ontological doodad, both together to give you the thing in question, then they're thinking simplicity doesn't require complexity. Sorry. They're thinking simplicity can be had in a thing that's complex in some sense. And the only thing I'm seeing there that's simple in the way I typically think of simplicity is the divine nature in such a case. But that's just what the theory I'm giving offers, is you're simple insofar as your nature is wholly without parts. So I would take those guys in their view, and the fact that nobody called foul on them, hey, wait a second, as some evidence that they were thinking of simplicity more in line with what I've given here and less in line with what I started with, has no parts or differentiation in any way respect, no matter what period. I think that's too strong for a Christian.
One follow-up question before I do want to give the audience a chance. Oliver, I've got a question for you. I think you are, if I'm correct, are probably the most steeped in Reformed tradition of the guys here. Maybe Tom, you know it, but I guess you're a Wesleyan. I don't know. Does that count as Reformed? Maybe it does. Oliver,
Arminius was a Reformed pastor.
Yeah, there you go. So we'll count it. When it comes to the 39 articles, I think, or the Westminster Confession of Faith, I think they both use sort of the same terminology when it comes to divine simplicity, where it's without body parts or passions.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe, like we mentioned, Tom, your studies in this would piggyback on this a little bit, but what account of simplicity is that requiring someone to believe if they want to confess what that confession says? Because looking at it, just the words, it seems pretty thin. But if you want to look at what the authors thought themselves, I think from my reading, it seems like there's a more robust account behind the scenes, more akin to something like the identity thesis. So is there a way to reconcile those confessions with different models of divine simplicity, or not?
I think yes, because I think they actually are they don't commit you to a sort of high, they don't necessarily commit you to a high octane account of divine simplicity. But I do think that here you might want to raise questions about authorial intention. So, I mean, one question when it comes to confessional and creedal documents, a bit like when it comes to biblical documents, is not just what the documents themselves say or imply or entail, but you might also think what the authors intended to convey, if you think that that adds a further level of potential hermeneutical complexity. My own view is that those theologians in the kind of Reformed tradition who are confessional and who take the confessionalism seriously should seek to take into account the dogmatic statements of the confessions, but they're not necessarily committed to the views of the authors themselves, since they're not, it seems to me, part and parcel of the confessions. And in the case of without bodily parts and passions, I think what we're committed to, if you take those confessions at face value, is that God does not have essentially body, which of course is orthodox. He doesn't have parts. Well, that's ambiguous between lots of different things that could be, metaphysically speaking. And he doesn't have passions. Again, that's ambiguous, but it's certainly consistent with the majority view that God is, in some important sense, essentially unchangeable, and unchangeable in his passions in particular. So, I mean, it seems to me that still leaves wide open a range of views on this, just how simple the divine nature actually is.
Tom, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I mean, yes. So, as Oliver said, Arminius was a Reformed theologian in good standing in the Reformed Church of the Netherlands when he died. He lost a vote a decade after he was gone. And of course, there's lots of stuff, right? But here's the interesting thing. Not only do the people who are not, well, let me say it this way first. To your question, I don't think that the confessions dictate exactly which version of the doctrine of simplicity must be believed. I just don't think they do. And when we look at the major Reformed theologians who sort of fit in, and I guess depends on who's canon, right? And even that's going to be ambiguous. But the people of the Muller Guild, right? That sort of stuff. There isn't, again, just one view of this. And if there is, it certainly isn't going to be exactly Aquinas's view. Minimally, they're going to endorse a view according to which there are genuine distinctions, fundamentum in re. Now, which understanding of that we've got to go with is also debatable. My point here is not to settle all that; it's to say there's considerable complexity in the Reformed tradition on this point. It's not infinitely elastic or like anything goes, but yeah, my understanding of it is there is a range within the Reformed tradition. But secondly, I also want to point out, since Arminius did come up, that Arminius has a doctrine of simplicity. It looks to be more along the house and lineage of Scotus. He explicitly endorses a formal distinction and then uses it in various places. But sometimes this gets put out as if there's a story that sort of gets told, like the Reformed hold to this quote unquote classical doctrine of God with simplicity. And then, of course, because of that, they get this whole doctrine of this whole soteriology and a doctrine of predestination. Everything falls out from that. And that itself, my reading of the relevant parts, some relevant parts of this tradition run very differently than that, because they're also broadly speaking Arminian, both remonstrant, but also sort of Anglo-Arminian types who are scholastics, and Lutheran scholastics who all affirm divine simplicity, but then in some cases wield it against Reformed doctrines of predestination and the divine will. In other words, they're saying to the Reformed, sometimes directly, like Gerhard Dzonke, for instance, you say these things about simplicity, amen and hallelujah. But if you take these things about simplicity seriously, you can't say these things about the divine will, not with any consistency. Again, I'm not passing judgment or weighing in on who gets that stuff right. I'm just saying there are different accounts of simplicity that get used differently within and across these Protestant scholastic traditions. So I have really hard time thinking if you're going to go with Westminster or the three forms of unity or whatever, you've got to say endorse a particular account of what simplicity is.
Good stuff. So I do want to give people in the audience a chance to ask questions. So Ryan, I know you had a question, and I was going to let you go first since you chatted with me directly. I will, if you turn on your video, I'll add you to this section here. So I think you all know that.
Fancy. Okay, so I'm having a bit of cognitive dissonance here, so I'm hoping maybe you guys can help me out. So I keep hearing this assertion that there's all these different views of divine simplicity in the tradition. And so Oliver's like, okay, let's get rid of this pure act stuff. Maybe God's got some properties. And I'm like, hey, that sounds great, but I reject divine simplicity. So, what's the difference between you and me? And then I keep hearing Tom say, look, again, all these different versions of divine simplicity in the tradition. And I'm curious if there's a different way to read the history of Western thought here. So one way to read it might be this. Christians, Jews, Muslims, they all knew exactly what simplicity was, but a bunch of Christians decided to continually fudge on what they meant it is. And here's why I think that. So when I look at just focusing on the Muslim tradition, when I get to the 1000s and what becomes the majority view in the Muslim tradition is to go, there's this thing called simplicity. It's, no attributes, no properties, no forms, none of this nonsense, no parts. We hate that. We hate that view. It's against Quran. What we're going to say instead is God has distinct attributes, has distinct acts, or has one act, but it's not identical to the divine nature. And so I'm like, okay, well, that sounds like they know what simplicity is. And they go, Al-Maturidi, Al-Ghazali, all these others go, yeah, we know what simplicity is, it's false. And we're going to affirm a view that looks identical to Oliver Crisp's view. And I'm like, okay, cool. I can understand this. But then you guys are like, oh, no, there's all these different views of simplicity. And I'm like, I don't think I understand this now. What it sounds more reasonable to me is this Muslim view of going, we know what simplicity is, either you like it or you don't, instead of going with a bunch of these other views of going, ooh, yeah, there's a bunch of views of simplicity. So help me with this cognitive dissonance. Which should I go with?
Well, I'll take a first step. It strikes me that there are different ways of thinking about the unity of the divine nature in the tradition. We've spoken of several of them already in this session, and it's a bit like, how warm do you want your water to be in your bath? It can be tepid, it can be warm, it can be extremely warm, or it can strip your skin off. Now, it would still be warm, even if it's not going to strip your skin off, but tepid, it's not that warm, and you might not want that because you get chilly pretty quickly. Similarly, it seems to me with respect to thinking about the unity of the divine nature in the tradition, there are going to be some people who think warm is warm enough, some who want an account of divine unity that's going to strip your skin off, and some people who think all of that stuff is really not very helpful, and the best way to think about these things is to be a little bit tepid. So I think that there's evidence of that sort of difference in the tradition, and there's been recent responsible historical work on this sort of stuff that's pointed out that there's more than one way of carving up this cake in the tradition. Sure, there are going to be some people who, on the one hand, claim that they're defending some doctrine of divine simplicity, but secretly are overturning it in what they actually teach, or some people who sort of say, okay, maybe this is part of the tradition, but sotto voce, we're not going to endorse the tradition on this point. Of course, that's going to be true as well. But I don't think that, well, it would seem odd to me to think that a lot of these sort of historic theologians who thought they could endorse some doctrine of divine simplicity and something like the doctrine of the Trinity were all either doing the sotto voce thing or were fudging it, or in some other way being disingenuous in the account that they gave of the divine nature. That seems extremely unlikely to me.
Scott, you had a follow-up?
Oh, sure. Just to respond to Ryan's question, I'll give you 3 examples of trajectory. And you can read all this. Garrett Smith wrote his PhD at Notre Dame and finished like 2013 on history of divine attributes from Aquinas to Occam. And so he shows that with Aquinas, the divine attributes are distinct as conceived by creatures, rooted in the divine nature, but they're distinct as creatures think about God. So God's relationship to creatures is a necessary condition for the distinction of divine attributes. Henry Ghent rejects this sort of view. He says, no, God doesn't need any creatures thinking about God in order for the attributes to be distinct. Rather, they're distinct in God's own thought. At least that's what Garrett says. I have a textual disagreement with more details about that. But then Scotus says, no, divine attributes are distinct prior to anybody's thinking about the divine nature. So each of them claim divine simplicity, but each of them have a different ontological account of the truth makers for distinction of divine attributes. Those are just three scholastics. There's several others who have other ways of try to nuance it. And you also know there are distinctions in the Islamic tradition too. Fans of Avicenna are going to think we can talk about God meaningfully. Even the later Avicenna have univocal concepts of divine attributes, and some of his followers like Al-Tusi is going to think we can have some univocal concepts of God that are distinct prior to any thoughts, right? And then there's Al-Shahrastani who said, no. God is so different from us, all language is equivocal, right? And so all of those people might claim divine simplicity, and they just might mean something like God is a necessary being, like Avicenna taught us. Yeah.
Tim, Tom, any follow-up on that question? Okay. All right. So far I've received two other questions. This one might be a little bit short. I'm not sure. And I think, Tom, you've done some work on this. So one of them that was chatted in here, given the recent debates among Calvinistic Baptists, which I'm not expecting you all to know all that goes on with that very small subsegment of denominational life, is the idea of eternal relations of authority or eternal functional subordination, submission, whatever I feel like there's 10 different acronyms for the same thing. In the Trinity, is that view compatible with the great tradition in any way? So can you take the idea that the Son eternally submits, even in a functional way, and make it fit with the tradition? And I don't know, Tim, I don't know if you're familiar with that view or not, or if any of you guys are. So I'll let whoever wants to take that one, take that.
I'll just respond briefly that if the Son submits to the Father, then the Son might have an act that the Father doesn't have. So you've already got some kind of account of personhood there that might motivate it. I mean, there are other motivations for that sort of debate, but suppose you don't have that kind of account of the Trinity, which is the common sort of view in the tradition, right? Then the idea that the Son eternally is submissive to the Father, it's just not going to get off the ground because the divine persons share numerically the same operations. But if you think of the divine persons as distinct individuals, subjects of distinct thoughts, then yeah, you can think that the Son could theoretically be submissive to the Father, and the Father's not submitting to himself.
Any follow-ups on that one?
No, I'm sorry. I fear I don't know much about the recent debates among Calvinistic Baptists. Sorry about that.
I've my views on this. I mean, I've killed too many trees on this already. I don't really have a whole lot more to say, but except to say that there are differences at multiple levels. Scott's indicated some. I mean, just issues with respect to the whole framework of the doctrine of Trinity underneath the actual question that's at stake. Here's where I'm going to go. You know, someone like Thomas Aquinas addresses this stuff directly. Doesn't call it Arian, or fairly directly. Doesn't call it Arianism, but says it's better to avoid the this to avoid the error of the Arians. Basically, I do want to add that one caveat, Bo Branson has done work in some patristic theology. It's not the same thing as the Wayne Grudem, Bruce Ware view by any stretch, but I just want to alert that there may be some complexities there that places people might be able to find some room. I will say that finally, there is direct patristic precedent for a view much like this recent Baptist view in the 4th century. The most direct precedents are the non-Nicene views. not necessarily Arian views, but like some of the Homoians type statements, like their macrostitch and other statements come a lot closer. Whether you take that as a vote of support for the doctrine or a vote against it is another question.
Which
You may
I think
also-
Bo's
yeah.
here actually. So if you want to chat something, you're welcome to chat it. Oh, you're not to be trusted. Fair
The
enough.
liar's paradox there, Bo.
Scott, you were going to say something?
Oh, yeah. So you may find such a view among some of the Miaphysite Trinitarian theologians in the 500s and 600s, which is the view that's rejected by Constantinople III. And according to them, right, the number of personal acts is according to the number of divine persons. You got 3 persons, you got 3 distinct or 3 mental acts or acts of will. So their kind of model would be consistent with the idea of what a one divine person submitting to another. More on that some other time. Yeah.
Which remind me, all you guys, you would say, each of you affirm like Nicaea, Chalcedon, all that. So everybody's in agreement. Scott, are you in agreement? I can't remember.
I'm sorry, I was reading a comment. Was agreement to what?
So Nicaea and Chalcedon, you would say yes, 2 thumbs up. Those are accurate summations of what the tradition has thought and should be believed.
And Constantinople III.
And Constantinople III, which I'm good with.
Which
that.
affirms the Nicene Constantinople Creed also.
Okay. Because I do think when I've seen, there's been, just a ton of discussion on this, and it seems like there's worries that if you don't take a very hard line stance on certain things, then you are outside of Nicaea or others. So let's see, we've got a couple questions have come in. Oh, I think this is interesting. What issues to do with classical theism need more work or attention from the next generation of, he said analytic theologians, but I'll just say theologians in general. What areas should be focused on?
So I'll say a little bit about that. I can only speak from my perspective. I think it'd be cool to hear what like non-Christian folks thought about that question too. But from my perspective, I think it'd be great if there was more discussion of questions of authority in the ecclesia. So like in virtue of what is this to be trusted or that to be trusted? Why trust this canon? Billy Abraham did great work on the canon. I'd like to see an upcoming generation of analytic folks pick up that work and keep doing that sort of work, trying to determine the principles we can employ to determine what's authoritative and not, and why. That's more epistemology. I do mostly metaphysics and this stuff, but I'd like to know the epistemology better. So someone else should do that work for me so I can read it.
Oliver, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Well, I'm not sure whether I've got something that is specific as a project for up and coming theologians. I do agree with what Tim's just said. I think more work on the notion of authority and theological authority is probably sorely needed at this point in time. There are interesting issues along the way, but I'm not sure it's going to take a generation to resolve them. So, for example, there's been some recent interest in theological fictionalism of various sorts, which might have a bearing on what you think about the doctrine of God. But I take it that that's a sort of local dispute. It's really to do with certain people who have a particular interest in whether or not you should be a kind of theological realist or anti-realist of a particular kind, and what that commits you to, in terms of doctrine of God, liturgy, things like that. So I'm not sure that's really a project for an entire generation, though I think it's an interesting current topic of debate that bears on these questions.
I would like to see I'd like to see more good work done on the issues that are getting attention, like the stuff we're talking about today. I don't think we're done with these discussions, but also would like to see contemporary work that's informed by the tradition and analytic in orientation, whether harder or softer versions or whatever. I would like to see that go in a couple different directions as well. Methodologically, one, more engagement with this is hard. I've tried a little bit, but it's not easy for me at least. But more engagement with actual biblical scholarship and indeed scripture, Christian scripture, and going a very different direction methodologically. I'd like to see more of it engaged with insights from social sciences and natural science. Especially, I mean, there are some really challenging issues. Oliver keeps talking about our time, like theology for our day. And there are a whole host of issues that are really important in our day that really could use a good dose of analytic theological clarity and engagement, hopefully bringing some of the wisdom of the Christian tradition forward. I'd like to see more of that done as well. And I hope people will step up. I don't want to see, let me just say this, if I can say this, I don't want to see the sort of analytic theology project or the adjacent sort of retrieval projects sort of devolve into antique collecting projects where, we could sort of align our relics, our sort of intellectual relics, and then invite each other over to our showrooms and say, I've got all these lined up and I've got these lined up, and sort of congratulate ourselves that we're really in touch with some really smart people who came before us. I hope we don't do that. And I hope that analytic theology doesn't turn into just sort of a spin-off of what really smart metaphysics folk do when they're kind of bored and interested on their way home from Sunday school or something like that, right?
I do want to let one more question come in before we wrap up. Brandon Smith, do you want to turn on your camera? I'll let you ask it since I know you. So you get special treatment. Let's see here. I'll pin you up here to spotlight you. Maybe if he's paying attention. Still muted and still. So he asked a question. I'm going to put him on the spot. So he said, what do you say? I'm in a car driving. Okay. Well, good for you. So Brandon, he said, is there an entailment of classical theism that anyone might say is easiest to discard? So he gave some examples: singular will, eternal generation, aseity. And he said, I use this term as it's being used among many writing on the topic, recognizing it's a loose term.
So what can you get rid of in your classical theism?
Yeah, what's the easiest one to say this is the most negotiable? Or is it just a complete package? Because I think a lot of classical theists will say everything entails one another. So I don't know if you can really get one without kind of tumbling the Jenga tower.
Yeah, I mean, I think I do think it's a metaphysical package deal for sure. But of course, the package can be packaged in different ways, right? There's not a single version of classical theism. So various things can be negotiated. We've even been talking today about ways in which a particular account of divine simplicity can be negotiated, or a particular account of the divine Trinity. But I think probably there are ways in which one might want to negotiate some of the divine predicates that are often, or have in the past often been talked about, whether they're the omni predicates or eternity or immutability or aseity or ultimacy. Perhaps not ultimacy, but I mean, aseity is an interesting one, depending on how you construe that. Roman Catholics seem to think that aseity is really terribly important these days, and very much non-negotiable, as it bears on things like the doctrine of creation and whether or not the created order is really related to God and stuff like that. Well, I don't know. That seems to me to be something that would be worth thinking through with some care. It does have all sorts of entailments that are very peculiar, it seems to me.
Tom?
I again want to say that I do think that there's more. I agree with Oliver that in some sense these things are packaged, and doctrinal commitments on any level have entailments for other issues and other topics. So yeah, these do go, there are ways in which, of course, these do go together as package deals. But I just want to, sorry, I keep saying these things, but I do want to slightly complicate these discussions a bit. Brandon's question, as I'm seeing it, does have classical theism in scare quotes now. but he refers to singular will. And that is not as straightforward or as easy as we might sometimes make it out to be, even to think about that. Yes, in some sense, there is a singular will. That's just basic, I think, basic to traditional views. But as like Khaled Anatolios, in his patristic work says, there are distinct inflections of this divine will. There are agreements of this divine will among the three divine persons. So it's slightly odd to me and not necessarily a good sign, I think, when people who are often quick to criticize importation of univocity into theology, right? When it comes to singular will, we just assume we know what it means, and we just sort of tap out whatever we take to be as the psychological notion that's just sort of common sense. Then we just push that out and say, yep, there's obviously one of those in God. I don't think it's quite that straightforward or simple. Yes, there's some sense in which there's a singular will, but do we just take a common sense psychological notion and then just push that up to God and say, obviously that's what this is? That doesn't seem to me like a very good move either. And again, not one that's even, I think, arguably traditional. So thanks.
Scott, you had something?
Oh, Brandon suggested, could we get rid of eternal generation? If you want to be a conciliar Christian, you can't get rid of eternal generation. What distinguishes the persons are, right? One of them, the son's distinguished by eternal generation. Whatever else you want to say. One mistake some people make, I can't remember, there's somebody here, I thought I made this mistake before, regarding aseity. They might think that aseity is a personal property as well as an essential property. But in at least a lot of the tradition I've read is aseity is meant in two ways, right? So the Father is ase as a person, not from another person, but the Son is from another person as a person. Regarding the Son's nature, or the essence is ase, not from another essence. So this is going to be a big point of dispute between the Christians and people like Avicenna. They're going to distinguish between person and nature. And some divine persons are ase as a person, namely only the Father, but not the Son and the Spirit. But in terms of their singular nature, they are ase because they're not from another numerically distinct nature. Yeah, some people might want to give up on whatever the relational distinctions between the divine persons. But if you do that, you might, I think that tritheism is very quickly around the corner. And tritheism is bad because it doesn't fit with Christian revelation, I don't think. The scriptures. Anyways.
Cool.
That's
Thanks, Scott. Any closing comments from any of you guys? Because I know we're over time.
Yeah, I'd just like to say thank you to Jordan. You did a great job with this. I know it's been, kind of unsettling to get going, but you did a great job. Tim, Oliver, Scott, I love you guys. Always good to be with you, even in this way. And I know we've had several dozen people hanging out and patiently throwing up questions, some of which we didn't get to. Sorry about that. And thank you very much. Hope our paths cross and soon. Thanks.
Yeah, so let me just recommend to all of you, you need to go buy their books. You need to read their articles, and you have opportunities to study with them. So if you're interested in studying with them, you should probably reach out, whether that's at master's level or doctoral. I don't know, Scott, if you have doctoral level at UNC Asheville or not, but you have a chance to study with all of them in some way. So I would encourage you to look at those opportunities because I think these are for the very best and brightest scholars out there on this topic. And plus they have a way of going about it that is right and honorable. So I mean, sometimes the debates in this sort of stuff can get heated because we're talking about God, and that matters a lot. But they carry themselves very, very well and respectably and honorably. And I really, I think we want to commend those sort of attitudes when it comes to this topic. So thank you to you four for doing that and doing that throughout this panel. Hopefully for everybody's listening, this has really helped you, challenged you, stretched you, give you something to think about, encouraged you. And we thank you for hanging in there through the changing platforms and me having to mute everybody individually and all that kind of stuff, because I'm not good with this, but I need to get better for next time. So thanks everybody. This has been awesome. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Thank you. Bye.
See ya.